Dan zou ik nu graag onze volgende gastsprekers uitnodigen. Mevrouw Fionnuala Rogerson en mevrouw Monika Klenovec. Mevrouw Rogerson is een Ierse architect en toegankelijkheidsadviseur.
Miss Rogerson is an Irish architect, and she's advising cultural heritage. Miss Klenovec, she's our first guest speaker. She's the representative of ANAC. She's an architect from Austria. She's a lecturer in Vienna. She's focusing in universal design. And today she will talk to you about the ISO standards on a sustainable cultural heritage, and then our next speaker will give you practical examples from Europe. The floor is yours.
This interesting event and to present you in a very, let's say, short time, this future standard on accessibility of immovable cultural heritage, about the principles and the methodology of interventions. And you will be the first audience you hear this presentation and to get knowledge about a very interesting future standards project. Is it working? No? Which one? I have this one. Yes, thank you. I'm providing you now a very short overview about the standard. The full title is Accessibility and Usability of the Built Environment, Accessibility of Immovable Cultural Heritage, and about the principles and the methodology for interventions which you should follow and apply. The mother committee, let's say, the ISO committee dealing with this subject is 59 Subcommittee 16, which is the title Accessibility and Usability of the Built Environment. It's also the responsible technical committee for the ISO standard 21542, which may be already familiar in this round. The work has started in autumn 22, and a new working group was established, Working Group 4. And the basic of this work was a previous technical report from Spain, which has been widely revised. The chair is also coming from Spain. It's Nieves Peonado Magalev, and the secretariat is at UNE and was started by Stephen Jenkel and followed now by Elena Gaia Monco. The first stage was already reached, which is usually the inquiry vote in November and ended in February with a very positive outcome. The voting result was 100% approval, and we had received, of course, many comments. And all the comments have been resolved in the formal vote version, which will be published in July. Probably, and there will be one vote for only yes or no vote in this stage. So the standard will be published, let's say, end of the year about. I give you now a short overview about the contents. The usual structure in standards is to have an introduction, to have a scope, normative references, terms and definitions. And finally, then the technical part is starting with the principles. The principles are focusing on strategic, technical, and operational principles. And then the methodology is summarized, focusing on the general accessibility objectives, on the analysis of the cultural object and its settings, divided into the heritage values and the access conditions. Then the specific accessibility conditions will follow. And finally, after an evaluation process, the proposals for action will be developed. And it's leading finally to the intervention plan. We have 5 different annexes in this standard. All are informative. They are focusing on accessibility needs, also on the general accessibility objectives, and on the general heritage values, and finally on the publicly available accessibility information, the so-called Access Guide we have introduced here. And also the Annex E is covering the examples of good practices of accessibility interventions, which Fionnuala will explain later on. The introduction refers already to the principles which have been considered in this standard to achieve accessibility and usability of the immovable cultural heritage in accordance with the universal design approach, and sets out a methodology for the implication of these principles according to the UN Convention. In the scope, it is also referred that the principles and the methodology for providing accessibility to immovable cultural heritage through interventions which are arising from conservation, from restoration, or specific accessibility needs, and it is applicable to immovable cultural heritage and also its settings. And it can be used by all interested parties, of course, from heritage owners, managers, restoration professionals, architects, accessibility professionals, etc. And it is not specifying management, maintenance, or service provision requirements. The general principles of this standard is referring to the inclusive society and the recognition and the valuing and the understanding of immovable cultural heritage and its significance, which implies that accessibility measures are implemented. Accessibility immovable cultural heritage enables all people to access, to use, and to enjoy it effectively along with its values. And it is also important that a balance shall be ensured between the conservation of its values and the achievement of specific social goals, as accessibility is one of these. It's starting with the strategic principles, where it is clearly said that equal importance shall be given to heritage and to accessibility. Accessibility shall enable access, use, and understanding of the cultural project. And the functional requirements of accessibility standards for the built environment shall also be considered. And a multidisciplinary approach shall be applied for each intervention. Finally, also an evaluation of the needs of users and possibilities of participation of different reference groups shall be provided. And any intervention, for instance, change of use, shall be evaluated to determine potential opportunities to improve accessibility. And all accessibility levels shall be reviewed and improved where and when required. Coming to the technical principles, it is clearly said that any new architectural element or space added to a cultural object shall consider accessibility requirements. And all accessibility actions shall be proportionate to the scope of the intervention. And the intervention shall not comprise any existing safety and accessibility conditions. You should also consider reversible solutions as long as they provide equal accessibility and safety compared to non-reversible one. The individual interventions should be considered as part of a site-wide plan based on the accessibility chain, which we have also included here in this standard. And where full accessibility cannot be achieved by physical changes, alternative access methods should be implemented. The final principles are the operational principles, and these should focus on, of course, is the first step which you have always to consider, that all relevant legal conditions, obligations, constraints, and rights have to be covered. The type and extent of intervention has to be described. A focus should be given on the diversity of users with physical, sensory, and cognitive disabilities or accessibility. The significance of the project has to be considered, of course, and also the technical and economic feasibility. And any assessment should be done by experts and reference groups if needed. Think about a museum where you want to have a special exhibition for blind people, which should also be covered. This gives a good overview about the applied methodology. It's referring to 5 different steps. You are starting with the determination of general objectives and adoption of strategy, and this leads to the output of a general objective and strategic description. Then it's followed by the analysis of the cultural object and its settings, separated to the heritage value study and the access study, which will be then combined, of course. And then you have to consider also any specific accessibility objectives. And this leads then to the access concept, which is the basis for the further work. In this access concept, you have to develop furthermore some proposals for actions, maybe different ones. And finally, you have to decide for one final proposal for action. And this leads to the final developed intervention plan, including also an access guide for public information. Now we go shortly to these different steps. The determination of the general accessibility objectives and adoption of strategies. The main goal of these should be the provision of optimum accessibility under the given constraints. And starting from the principles set out in clause 4, its general objectives and corresponding to the strategies which shall be defined here. And it's also important to consider the significance of the cultural heritage and to apply an inclusive approach referring to and involving user groups throughout the whole process. And, if needed, establish reference groups with physical, sensory, or cognitive impairments. Further on, we come to the chapter of the different analyses, first focusing on the heritage values study, which will be the final outcome, and the access study. So these analyses of the essential heritage values of the cultural object are very important and have to be documented in the heritage value study. And the analysis of any accessibility conditions are documented in the access study. Then you have to have final consolidation of the results of both analyses to identify the critical goals. Then it is followed by the specific accessibility objectives, which will documented finally in the access concept. And these can cover also the specific accessibility objectives, but only if they are needed. And when they are not needed, you have to explain the reasons why not. And this it will finally combine then the result of both analyses in the access concept. Then the next step is proposals for actions. The access concept, you can define a set of related actions, and this can be reached by, of course, construction interventions and by supplementary means. And finally, followed by the evaluation and selection of proposals, which are then the further basis for the development of an intervention plan. You have the several processes here included, the feedback from stakeholders, the impact of the heritage values, also the potential improvement on accessibility, the feasibility, of course, on different levels, and so on. And the outcome is then concluding in the intervention plan. And in the intervention plan, you have the key elements for the implementation process, and they are further detailed by a set of measures with a report, with public information, e.g. this access guide, which is newly introduced. So concluding, cultural heritage is a significant part of the collective history and cultural identity of a region, to which full participation and enjoyment of all peoples should be ensured and is a part of citizens' daily life, as we see here in Bruges. And according to the UN Convention, accessibility contributes to the full and effective participation of all people in immovable cultural heritage. And ISO 5727 will be a supportive tool to improve accessibility in cultural heritage. Thank you for your attention.
Dank u wel.
Thank you, Ms. Klenovec, for the insights in the ISO standard on accessible heritage. I will remember that heritage and accessibility should be treated equally. It can make us stronger in the future. And then I would like to invite Ms. Fionnuala Rogerson to give a couple of concrete examples on accessible heritage in Europe.
Let me just see if presentation is there. No. Have we got slides? Is that it? Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here with you today. I've been working with Monika and with a number of others who are here with us on the development of this standard over the last couple of years. And I have perhaps the easier task, rather than explaining what's in the standard, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how it can be applied to practical examples, how the methodology has been applied. Coincidentally, I've used an example which Angela has already referred to, which is St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and also another example which we haven't finally chosen to use, but we have investigated during the course of this work, and that is the Austrian Parliament in Vienna. So really, in talking about St. Paul's, I will be talking not so much about the end result, but about the process that has been used in order to achieve the intervention that was made, and focusing principally on the intervention which was access into the main floor of the cathedral. St. Paul's Cathedral, as many of you will know, is in London, and it was designed by Sir Christopher Wren, completed in 1711. And the main objective, which is the critical thing always, is what is the main objective of building owners or those in whom the building has been entrusted. And in this case, the main objective was to be welcoming and open to everybody. In the image that you see above you, the original north transept had over 20 steps in a semicircular direction around a columned portico. A conservation assessment was carried out, and that discovered that those steps were actually not original. Those steps dated from 1875 and not from the early construction. So, moving on. The first thing that was carried out, and this is a process that lasted over 20 years. First of all, there was an accessibility needs analysis. This equal access project, which Angela also spoke about, was the culmination of 20 years of research. Initially, there was access to the cathedral floor, but through the opposite side of the building. And you went into a central courtyard where there was a lift, which could take one wheelchair user or one person with a mobility impairment at a time. The need for permanent inclusive access became evident when many of the events that take place in the cathedral would accommodate up to 50 wheelchair users and many other people who would have required access. So, through continuous consultation, a brief was formulated and an outline design and specification. The design concept, which was to access through the north transept, is illustrated here in a diagram or a drawing, which shows the approach which was to create a symmetrical ramp both sides of a stepped entrance in a sinusoidal fashion. An important thing very often with this kind of critical intervention is how you test the proposal in advance. And in this case, a temporary ramp was built reflecting the initial design concept, and it was installed and kept in place for several years while people used it. They used it during the 2012 Paralympics. We heard about the Paralympics earlier and the impact that Paralympics can have on a city. And it was used to allow the many, many visitors to London access the building. And during that phase, with the temporary ramp in place, they tested with the users, those who were accessing the cathedral, what worked and what didn't work. It wasn't possible to meet the regulatory guidance, and this is frequently the case, that you can't actually achieve what may be in your standard or in your building regulation. And that was that indicated the importance of actually testing it to make sure that it would work. A one-way system was devised because the ramp under English standards would have required to be nearly 2 meters in width under normal circumstances, but it wasn't possible to achieve this. They were much narrower. So a one-way system was devised where you would go up one direction and you'd come back down in the opposite direction. And this illustration that I've shown now shows how the new steps and the ramp were actually built over the original ones. So that concept of reversibility, which we've heard about already, was put into practice. So in fact, you could remove the new intervention, the steps and the ramp, if at any future stage. But of course, we all know that that is never likely to happen. Another important fact in this process was that people were kept informed. It is very important to let people know what you were doing while you were carrying out this research. First of all, you need to tell people how long it's going to take, for how long are they going to have to use the temporary facilities, for how long is the building going to be closed, perhaps, and what is happening. And that was done successfully by the cathedral authorities. Another important point was the testing. The architects, who were Caro Architecture, who worked very closely with Martin McConaughey, ICDS, who were the accessibility consultants, they constructed full-scale models and full-scale details in order to test them. They did ergonomic testing of the entrance area, of the ramps, of the gradients, this is something that it's a luxury to be able to do it, but it is actually a very important feature. I'm now showing an image of the entrance portico, which was developed inside the main entrance to the cathedral, using timbers which came from the original forests that Sir Wren had actually used timber from. What this portico does internally within the cathedral is it allows for both lighting and acoustical adjustment. So for people who need to adjust going from a very bright area outside to a much darker area inside, as they move through, this new portico has assisted in that transition. There is also above the portico an acoustical glazed screen which softens the sound and acts as a transition space between outside and inside. As you will know, any of you that are architects in the audience will know the level of detail that goes into doing something like this. It's not just your big plans, your concepts, and your general arrangement, but there is so much detail that has to be considered of every element. The materials here were tested for slip resistance, for their light reflectance, and how they would perform in all weather and lighting conditions. And the ergonomics of the design was evaluated at each step in the process. High-quality materials were used: Portland stone, granite paving, and aluminium bronze. And the outcome, which is an image that you've seen before, which is this very beautiful, elegant sinusoidal ramp on either side of the steps going in. I did have a conversation just earlier with Delphine from Spain, who doesn't like the final result as much as I do. So obviously it's not necessarily about the quality in terms of what we're showing now. It's not necessarily about the quality of the outcome, but I personally feel it is a very good and quality outcome in this case, but it's about the process in arriving there. And not everything will always be perfect. Sometimes there will have to be compromises. So the second example I'm going to talk to you about is not one which we have finally used in the draft standard, but is one which we considered in the draft standard. But because I had the opportunity to visit it 2 weeks ago and was very impressed visiting both with the architect and with the access consultant, I thought I would include it as an example here. This is the Austrian Parliament building in Vienna, which was originally designed by Theophil Hansen, a Danish architect, in 1853 or 1883, and it comprises 2 houses of parliament. It was very badly damaged during the Second World War, and then in 1945, the damage was made good, it was restored, but in a style which was quite modernist. So much of the interior of the part that had been damaged was not as critical from a historical perspective as some of the parts which I will also show you. It has been listed as a Grade 1 building by UNESCO, and it is also a World Heritage Site. It was reopened only last year, following approximately 6 years of alterations and restorations, and it's that work that I will now talk to you about. I'm now showing a section of a model. That's a cut through the middle of a model, which was done by the architects who are Jabornik and Pelfi in Vienna. And what you see in this image is the symmetrical nature of the building. On the right-hand side, you have the Chamber of Deputies, and on the left-hand side, there is the Chamber of the Federal Council, with a central access. And it's on multiple levels, and you will see in this section all the different floor levels and the complexity of trying to link all of these floors in one accessible chain. So the main steps in the process, this is a slide given to me by the access consultant who had worked on this project for, I believe, nearly 30 years. So you can imagine how long it takes to fully get to know and understand a building as complex as this. So the main steps in improving the access inclusion, well, the first thing was to develop a comprehensive strategy. Then an access study was carried out, an inventory was developed for all the different areas. In parallel, an analysis was carried out of the historical parliament. From that, an access concept was then developed, leading to an access plan, or an action plan. At this point, in 2014, I think it was, 2014, an architectural competition was organized, and following the appointment of the architects and the design team, then the proposals were developed. An access plan then came out of that with the actual proposals, and then an intervention plan, and an access guide, finally, now that the building is complete, as Monika has described. And I would emphasize in this case the importance of a very close understanding between the access consultant, if you have an access consultant, but the person responsible for access with the conservation architect and the conservation authorities. Again, the main objective in this case was to be accessible and inclusive, with equal participation of disabled people in the democratic process, because this was a building about democracy. The needs analysis that was carried out identified many barriers, which obviously had to be prioritized. Nearly all floors had steps with very limited access via lift. The doors were all very narrow. There was visual information only. There were very few handrails in the building. There was no provision at all for wheelchair users in the chambers. And there was no provision for emergency evacuation for people with disabilities. So the short-term action plan before this competition was carried out was to create access to the public gallery, to improve the signage, to provide emergency exits and refuges, and to provide accessible routes to the first and second floors, and some modification of the lifts and steps. These are a few images just of some of the small short-term things that were done before the major works were carried out. So handrails, for example, were inserted on the stairs where previously there were none, and places of refuge were created. The access concept then, before the competition in 2014, it formed part of the competition brief together with the analysis of the heritage values. And they identified which areas were open to change, including the entrance foyer, which they had been damaged previously and restored in 1945, and the Federal Council chamber. 4 new staircases and lifts were proposed from ground to 4th floors, and the winners were the architects I have previously mentioned. The intervention plan began with consideration of the point of arrival, creating accessible parking, providing external access to the building and the main entrance. There were over 17 accessible lifts installed, with a platform lift and inclined lifts. There were new ramps to allow you to arrive into the reception area in the main part of the building. Tactile guidance was provided throughout. Doors were automated and power assisted. There were over 37 accessible WCs, toilets, sanitary provision throughout the building. There were induction loops installed in all areas where there would be meetings, and of course in the council chambers. And fire safety and evacuation was provided from all areas. Again, the accessibility chain was considered from the point of arrival, from your set-down point where the taxis or cars can arrive at the front of the building, and then a route leading up through the around the fountain, which also provides a certain sensory indication of the new building entrance, which is beneath the original ramp, which would have led to a higher level. And that chain then continues throughout all the public areas in the building. There is continuous tactile guidance everywhere. And actually, I noticed on some earlier photographs that I received from the access consultant that the tactile guidance, in fact, didn't provide color contrast. But when I saw it a couple of weeks ago, this was obviously something that had been changed in the interim, and it now provides not only visual contrast, but also tactile. The level changes were, I don't have a very good image of the 2 ramps, but again, there were symmetrical ramps which led from the main entrance through up on either side into an entrance foyer. And you see also here some of the new lifts. What they did was they used some interior courtyards and inserted new staircases and new lifts into each of the interior courtyards, which allowed them to actually access onto each of the floor levels. I'm sorry, yes. So in the main entrance, just before the reception area, there is a tactile model of the building. And you see here in the image on the left-hand side, the architect for the building who was explaining to us how the model was developed. There is also a tactile plan which identifies all the principal facilities that you would want to visit if you were a visitor to the building. And they also provide information via QR codes and in English and Austrian Sign Language. Here you see some of the more historic parts of the building on the left-hand side, the main hall of columns, and through testing with users, and they found that the installation of carpet, such as had been in the building on some of the historic floors, provided adequate guidance, so they didn't continue with the tactile guidance paths that you see in the image on the right-hand side, which are used primarily in the new part of the building. But carpet or existing tiling, where existing tiling did have something that one could follow, they were retained in other parts of the building. The historic doors, there were almost 700 doors in the building which had to be taken down, modified. They were all made into fire doors. They were all automated and power assisted, those that weren't automated. We saw something similar yesterday here in the provincial court, and that had been done, as we were told, in the building here. And that's a major task with this type of door, to actually cut them in two down the centre, insert the fire protection that needs to be inserted, and then to deal with the accessibility issues. The Chamber of Deputies, which had remained intact and had not been damaged during the war, is still raked, but what has happened is that they have inserted or included space for wheelchairs on the upper level, and they've also installed a platform lift on a spiral staircase going down to the lower level, where people who are able to use an inclined platform lift are able to get to the lower level. This room is no longer used as a chamber for debate, but is used mainly for public events and for the very occasional swearing in of the president. On the other hand, the federal chamber, which is the chamber that is in daily use, has been refitted completely, and this was also the chamber which had been damaged and therefore was less critical in terms of the modifications that were carried out to it. It has been made fully accessible with accessible seating on multiple levels. There is ramped access down through each of the levels, and then in different positions in the tiering of the seats, there is fully accessible seating areas so that you can sit at different levels and at different heights. Equally, as well as all the chambers, all the meeting rooms, I've shown an image of one of the meeting rooms on the right-hand side, which have been fully fitted with induction loops. The library has media stations with mobile devices, orientation, tactile and acoustic provision, and the principle of using a minimum of 2 senses was something that was used throughout. So all information is available by at least 2 different senses. One of the important things in the library were the shelves and the shelving and how they could be made accessible. As it was historic shelving, it was also critical from a conservation point of view. So there was user testing, particularly with people with vision impairments, about how the shelving could be made more accessible. They have movable tactile cards. They have audible descriptions at the end of each shelf. And they have information provided in tactile lettering and also in Braille. And finally, just to say that even when it comes to some of the smaller elements, such as getting to the cloakroom on arrival, finding accessible lockers, and even an accessible ATM machine which meets with all European guidance with regards to the accessibility of ATMs. So to conclude, some of the factors leading to the success of this project, as told to me by the access consultant Bernard Hruska, the meticulous systematic checking of all details throughout design and construction is very important. The evaluation and verification of any changes to proposals with any job of this size, with any intervention of this scale, there will inevitably be changes which occur all the way along the route. So it's so important that the person responsible for checking this checks at each change point. The general use of the principle of 2 or more senses for him was a very important factor. The engagement with interest groups, with people with disabilities, with advocates and with consultants, absolutely critical. Testing all innovative solutions, mobile ICT devices, the QR codes which were tactile as well, and NFC tags too. The targeted training of employees depending upon their area of responsibility. You saw that big hall of columns which I showed. When they have large events, the employees are actually trained how to move out carpet in that hall in order to facilitate people mobilizing around them, which can be helpful. And then the preparation of guidelines for accessible events and conferences. That's ongoing, that's something that has started, and it is continuing. So with that, I will just conclude this presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dank u wel, mevrouw Rogerson.
Thank you, Ms. Rogerson, to give us an inside look into how long and how sustainable such a process can be in order to make a building accessible. And it really struck me how important it is to test and to talk to experts by experience, to people who have a practical experience. It's really important to involve them from the very beginning.